It was lovely, actually, when the roll call was going on there, I heard student nurses called out, and I picked up immediately. It's a great profession. It really is a great profession. And there's a couple of people I want to acknowledge before saying the few words that I have to say. Two of the great leaders that I've experienced in my time are Sister Kinsella, nurse and midwife, and an extraordinary woman. And I've learned a huge amount from her, and I'll say that later. And also Mary Duff, who is in St. Vincent's, Director of Nursing there. I'd also like to acknowledge the many friends I still have from students who I've been privileged to teach on courses with. It's great. But anyway, I wanted to acknowledge those two. In particular, in the few words I have to say to you, there may be some points that I leave out. There may be some that I include, and maybe you don't agree with all of them. But I would ask you to believe this, that I say them with huge respect for your profession, particularly at this time and in the circumstances that you and the leadership now find yourselves. I won't take up your time by talking about the great things that are happening, and there are good things happening, and I'll touch on some of them later, because it's important to keep a balanced perspective and to retain a sense of optimism. But I'm afraid some of these developments, good as they are happening not because of the regime that we find ourselves working within, it's in spite of that. I think the leadership shown within the professions, nursing, midwifery, and all the other professions with whom you engage and work and collaborate, really that's keeping, in my view, the lid on the consequences for healthcare in Ireland of the most difficult times in modern Irish history. I'd like to begin with a few words, if I may, on how we got ourselves where we are today, particularly in relation to healthcare. And then I'd like to put two perspectives to you. They shouldn't be irreconcilable, but they are. And the real challenge, I think, for the professions now is somehow or other to engage in a dialogue between those two perspectives. I want to turn then briefly to the importance of maintaining the integrity of the profession at a time when I would suggest it's under real threat. It is integrity in terms of a values-led profession and also a calling. Now, I'm also aware that many of you are coming from very different specialties within nursing and midwifery, different care settings. And I still think that there are, encompassed with everybody in the room, there are still priorities and still values and principles that bind you together as a community. So though I'm very conscious you are working from different perspectives in public health and in the acute sector, for example, there's much more there in common. Okay, let me begin with how I believe the health system and strategies have become emasculated. The global economic crisis, and especially the web of responses within the Eurozone, basically it has compromised the autonomy and integrity of the budgetary policy of indebted countries, including Ireland. Our macroeconomic policy, including the level and composition of expenditure in healthcare, and we should never forget that what's spent on health is not a cost, it's an investment. And the 2001 strategy the 2001 strategy was very clear on that. It's an investment with measurable benefits to health status and to the economy across all kinds of ways. But we seem to have forgotten that. Problem is our budgetary system is now essentially determined by the Troika, and is benchmarked essentially against costs and expenditures in Germany. The government, I would suggest, has relinquished the driving seat in terms of the healthcare budget, and it has committed to uncritically implementing the terms of the bailout programme. Specifically, direct and indirect interventions are very clear in the funding, the staffing, and the overall delivery of healthcare in Ireland. All of this is putting staffing and systems in a wholly untenable position. You know, the whole business of doing more with less, that kind of thing. Our nursing and midwifery professions have never been held more accountable and never had less respect in terms of their voice being listened to. The government's position, and one has to be balanced in these things, is that because Ireland is dependent on the Eurozone, there is no alternative. Notwithstanding the impact and the outcomes on our health system, the assertion is that cuts and cutbacks are necessary to rebalance Ireland's fiscal position so that the costs, including salaries, are deemed excessive compared with Germany. This policy framework, and Liam referred to it earlier as an economist, I believe is wrong. It's flawed in execution and it's flawed in its metrics. The theory underlying austerity as the prevailing orthodoxy has been largely discredited. There is also evidence, a growing body of objective international evidence that demonstrates that the austerity orthodoxy is having a counterproductive impact, God bless you, on, it's having a counterproductive impact on not only on health systems now, but into the future. That's very clear, but nobody is listening to that reason, evidence-based argument. The negative effects are measurable and they're significant, and you could do very well to look at the article in the Lancet about a year or so ago when it looked at Greece, and it looked at the extent to which the health system in Greece has been deconstructed. And you can read the literature around that, and that was 2 years ago almost, and a lot's happened since then. So the orthodoxy of austerity, which is impacting on the way we manage the economy, and in all kinds of ways on unemployment and the impact on health status that generates, the orthodoxy is wrong. That's, I believe, a reasonable interpretation on what's happened in the last 5 years, and its impact on healthcare has been catastrophic. Let me just touch on this for a moment, if I may. A couple of pictures. Now, you mightn't be able to see these at the back, but don't worry. In the heart of this is the person whose tests go to the lab, the person with whom you engage in all of your jobs, the people in the community that you have to serve. The person's in the middle. Now, here's what you're required to do. Here are the pressures that the system is under. The implementation of a whole reform agenda, including the hospital networks. Now, I'm not saying this is all bad, far from it. I'm simply saying there is a huge agenda there. That's one change pressure. Over here, there's the introduction and the planning for universal health insurance. That's massive. It's scheduled to happen by 2016. It won't happen by 2016, but the implementation of that is again a huge change pressure. Those two by themselves, you want to be in the whole of your health to be able to cope with those. But if we look at the top, we see a significantly fewer quantum of largely demoralized staff. That has its own pressures. And from here, we see massive funding cuts, based on what I believe is a delinquent funding model. And I'm happy to discuss that. So those are the kind of change pressures. Now, where are they coming from? Well, there's the Department of Health Statement of Strategy, Future Health, National Service Plans, Crow Park 1, Crow Park 2, Programme for Government. It's worth going, I'm sure many of you have, to the Department of Health's website and to look at the enormous quantums of strategies, reports. It's migraine inducing, and I'm sure it's all very good, but you're reminded of, what would you call it, indigestion, chronic indigestion. It's almost as if it has a life of its own that justifies itself and is semi-detached from where the practical day-to-day nursing in the community or in any care setting is actually at. And then the other side, we see unprecedented downsizing in staff, and your leadership will talk to that. Disproportionately large cuts in salaries and conditions. Now, I'm not saying that because I'm here. I'm saying that because I've worked with the profession in teaching and research for a long time. I'm saying that because I have, three very driven, motivated daughters who are nursing. My wife is a nurse, her mother was a nurse. I think Liam was right. I do see it. I also recall to you what the great, God rest his soul, Maurice Nelligan said about his daughter. Now, I talked to him the weekend before he died, and we were to meet later in the week because inevitably he was concerned with great passion for the healthcare system which he had served so well. We couldn't meet. We said we were to meet on the Monday. We couldn't meet, so he said we'll meet later in the week. It never happened. But he was a tough man. He was a great surgeon and an awesome man. But you'd have to be made of stone to listen to what he said, to read what he said about his daughter and her paycheck when she was going through, not to be moved by it, and to say he was absolutely right. He was absolutely right. Now, I'm a bit embarrassed by clapping because you know what's happened better than I do. And I'll just put the arguments to you and then see what you think yourself. This is what I think is happening out of the austerity program. The burden of adjustment, and adjustment is necessary in all of our public service, the burden of adjustment has fallen disproportionately on staff, nursing and midwifery. There is, it seems to me, a denial of responsibility. Who the hell is responsible? Where's the evidence? Where's the evidence? Well, it's always one stage further than the guys you can talk to. And this is in a profession where the public sector is constantly talking about transparency and accountability and all that kind of good stuff. The fact is the people in this room are the transmission belt for reforms, but they're not fully integrated into the decision-making, not only in a number of key domains and institutions. I mean, wouldn't you think that the medical and nursing professions are the first people you would engage in to say, how in the name of God do we cut costs? How do we reallocate resources? How do you do that? Well, I'll have more to say about that later, but it's an affront against common sense. And as I said, austerity, insofar as it impacts on healthcare policy, is refuted by the best emerging international evidence. Now, pretty pictures, you probably can't see it. What I'm trying to get at here is this. Here we have a quantum of funding which has fallen by 3 billion. Okay, now what can that produce in terms of outcomes? Stay with me, stay with me. What can it produce in terms of outcomes? Well, if we're sensible and we engaged in a trust-based dialogue, quite a lot, you would be up there in the best case with a participative culture, consultations and respect. You would listen to people. In fact, we're down here. The present case, and why are we down there? Because there's a leakage. There's a leakage, if this is a channel, there's a leakage across here of outcomes and potential savings. Where does that come from? Well, it comes from the loss of tacit knowledge from you guys as to how you manage the system. A loss of tacit knowledge. There's a lack of motivation. There's a lack of incentive, and I'll come to that. There's a coercive and adversarial culture, and it's been there, and I've written about it for a long time, and it just doesn't make sense. And there's an erosion of public trust. They're the leakages. If you were looking at a company instead of a healthcare system, you'd say that company is on its last legs. It simply doesn't know how to function properly. It's not creating value for the stakeholders. That's what I'm getting at. That's the lack of insight into how to get the best out of what is there and to get us through the present crisis. So that's the present environment. Now, I'm not going to, because of taking time up on that, I'm not going to talk about the figures, the reductions in the amount of money that's been made available. I'm not going to talk about cuts. Your colleagues will brief you on that, and if you want an idea of the scale of them, look at the National Service Plan and what it proposes to do. What I would say is, last September, I did an article for the Irish Times, and the thrust of the argument was that the healthcare overspend, which has been driven by the Troika, the whole idea of an overspend in health is a mythology. It's not there. It's not real. If you set the bar up here when you should be setting it here and people fall short, that's not an overspend. That means you're not making sufficient money available in the first place. So I think that's the context in which we have to look at something that is contentious. The issue of, and I'm almost reluctant to use these words, budget-priced nursing. Let me say this. If this scheme, the job bridge scheme is applied to recent graduates, if that had been introduced, let's say, at the initiative of a director of nursing, if it had been properly evaluated and monitored, if people were looking at the educational benefits to the student, to the graduate, and to the hospital, there might be merit in it. But that's not where it's coming from. Because if you look at the service plan, you'll see that it says they're providing 10 million, quote, set against the recruitment of graduate nurses to directly offset the amount spent on agency and overtime. So that'll tell you where the strategy is coming from. It's little to do, in my view, and I stand to be corrected, little to do with beneficently offering training places to our nurses. It has everything to do, in my view, with budget-priced nursing, which sells short the graduate and sells short the profession. You may well come to regret saying that. Anyway, look, there are two possible approaches to all of this. One of them is what I call contractual. And this is where the Troika and the state are coming from. We're talking contractual obligations, hours worked, headcount, terms and conditions. It's flawed and it's very foolish. If one reflects on it, it's very clear that the professions deliver over and above and beyond contractual responsibilities. Let me say this. I've been in a number of hospital settings in the last month or two. People turn up early and they leave late. They work over the weekends, at times when they're not seen. That's what's going down. That's what happens on the ground. A decision to stick solely to contractual obligations on the part of the professions would actually make it nearly impossible, if not impossible, to deliver on the objectives of the National Service Plan. But that's where they're coming from. And it's a failure to understand this and a failure to act on the understanding that leads to demotivation and distrust. And it's the worst possible perspective for the healthcare service in Ireland at this time and in these circumstances. But it's out there, the contractual vision. There is a different vision, and it's vocationally driven. Let's see, does the system work? Yeah. This is a very interesting book. Got it a couple of years ago. Raymond Tallis, who I think was the health correspondent of the Daily Telegraph, and it's called Hippocratic Oaths, as an O, or you can say O-A-T-H-S. And he says, professions are associated with a calling. There is a variety of more or less common features to be found in someone who has a calling, going the extra mile beyond anything that could be defined contractually, not being in too much of a rush to get home, though you have a life, and to be willing to be available at all hours in a way that is unconnected with remuneration. Incidentally, I remember talking to a consultant a couple of years ago, David Hickey, in Beaumont, and I was saying to him, you know, they were coming hard at the whole consultant's contract at the time. I asked him how many hours he worked. He said, Ray, I have absolutely no idea. And that's true. Anyway, it's to be genuinely compassionate and imaginative, that is, in thinking about ways of caring for people that could only come from really wanting to help, as opposed to merely delivering on contract. A willingness to carry the burden of worry and the personal risk that comes from taking responsibility. Underpinning all of this is an accountability to conscience. An accountability to conscience that goes beyond strict legal liability and a duty of care. A person who has a calling is driven by the desire to make things better and to make people better. Now that really impressed me because I think it describes very fairly the profession of healthcare that I know, but interestingly, there was once upon a time when banking was a profession marked by high trust. Now, there are very good people in banking, very ethical and very really good people, but the culture collapsed at a terrible price. And if you push vocationalism out of the healthcare system by focusing only on the contractual model, you are doing a very terrible thing. So, there's the two ways of looking at things, contractual and vocational. And there is a paradox here, because the state is attempting to navigate the system through this crisis, an unprecedented voyage, you might say, purely on a contractual basis. This is what will change. This is the headcount. This is the amount that the contractual approach. And yet it presumes that the professions will respond from their vocational values. There's an asymmetry here. They're coming from a purely contractual perspective, and yet they're expecting you to respond from a purely vocational perspective. That doesn't make an awful lot of sense. Last year, it was another piece for the Times, and I said, there is a lack of real engagement between government and the healthcare and allied professions. What is in place is cold and contractual. The model obsesses about metrics and contracts and control, but it doesn't deliver the proactive relationships. You know, can you do my shift for me? Can you do this? Will you take this patient? Will you that? It doesn't deliver the proactive relationships with those trained to care, and it cannot therefore deliver improved outcomes for patients at this time. Healthcare is scarred by a culture of adversarialism. There is much that could be done differently and much waste that could be eliminated from this system. No doubt there is much the government wants to do, but there is little incentive to engage now, especially when the savings are sequestered by a flawed system that doesn't go back to mitigating the effects of the cutbacks, and with barely an acknowledgement except, okay, what's next? If, in fact, I believe the state were to meet the professions on the common ground of vocationalism, which is a way of life for you, then the outcomes in terms of savings and of service provisions would be much different. There's nobody, as I said, better than you to evaluate what could be done differently, but there's no incentive to do it, either for you and your families or for the system. The only thing that's motivating, it seems to me, the innovations and the hours worked on that is care for the patient. But that can only happen where there's trust. So let me go back to, you've seen the kind of costs, I call it the costs of contractualism, but there's a different way of looking at this. And I'd say this, there's no profession that's exempt from the consequences of externally imposed bad policies or self-interest or power. What nursing and midwifery is about, it seems to me, is evidence-based care as a service to the person. It's very difficult to change foolishness. Structures won't change it. If structures change it, then the transition from health boards to the Eastern Regional Health Authority to the HSE and the Department of Health to the HSE and now to the HSE going back in, if structures solve the problem, we wouldn't have a problem. But it seems to me it must go differently. The system has to ask of itself, not changing you, but how can the system change itself? Because that's the real issue. Suppose, for example, instead of the contractual model, we go back to, see, the red is there because I think it signals negativity. But if you take the same circumstances, same pressures, and you have a vocationally driven model here, the green, then the lights go on. You see things differently. There's an engagement and trust. There's a basis for listening and saying, yeah, we can do these things differently. And if you do that, if you stay with us for a year or two, here's what we're going to do. Now, how do you turn the lights green? How do you change that? I think you look at people who've done it. And I'd like to give you just 2 or 3 examples. I was in St. Vincent's recently. I suppose I better say it because I was in with kidney stones. And they're fucking awful. They really are. Anyway, I was, they were just superb. I have to say they were just superb. But there was, opposite the chapel, some of you may know it, there's a plaque to Mary Aikenhead. Now, I read a biography of Mary Aikenhead quite a long time ago. John Sullivan wrote the introduction. The thing that I took away from that was St. Vincent's, her dream of a hospital. I wonder, do any of you know this? She sewed the bed sheets for the first St. Vincent's Hospital from a chair, you'd know, some kind of medical chair. She had severe scoliosis. So in St. Vincent's, the first one, in St. Stephen's Green, she sewed the first bed sheets for what was to become St. Vincent's Hospital. And you look at that woman, you look at that plaque, and you see what's become of that commitment, that understanding of healthcare as a calling. It's incredible. It's in very safe hands now with Mary Duff. But that's just one example. I was down the country about a month, 6 weeks or so ago, and it was in another hospital, in Mallow, small hospital. I was there to pay my respects to a man who was dying. And I guess you know the director of nursing in Mario. I mean, yeah. She won't, I hope, be embarrassed. What a legend. I knew Mary, and I met her again. And she's one of these figures who is always around. She has great insight, not only into the delivery of nursing care, but into the whole managerial model. Herself and the management and her relationships with the consultants have kept that hospital going. When the man died, God rest his soul, it was Easter Saturday, Mary was around. She was just around. That's what turns the lights green. Now she has a life too, and she's a family and that, but she's just around. That's what vocationalism is. One more final example. In the late 50s, 1950s, a young woman left to train for nursing in the North Infirmary in Cork. Some years later, she came back to do a midwifery in St. Finbarr's. And then she went back to St. Vincent's Hospital in Thigh as a young nurse. She thought she'd stay there. And then she had a calling within a calling. There were homeless guys coming to the door. There were people who were addicted because of the conditions at the time. She said she'd find a place for them. She did. She began with a dairy, an old dairy. That was the first Cúnmhaire. Today, Cúnmhaire campuses are spread across the entire island. They are superb. They're internationally accredited. Over half of the detox and residential rehabilitation of the country is delivered from those services, and the doors are open, and it's the toughest case mix. What a remarkable woman. She came to UCD 13 years. She came to UCD 13 years ago to receive an award. Interestingly, she came late. The secretary of the department was there. All the boys were there, lined up, and I finally phoned her up when it was running very late, and I said, "Where are you?" She said, "Oh, I thought you meant 9:30 this evening." Now, that's what she said, and she came in and she slipped in easily. But there was a lovely point there. Those are the hours she worked. Those are the hours she worked. I saw her with my students, and it was mesmeric. She just had them in the palm of her hand without trying. And I've seen her with people who are very sick, and I've seen her with women who are very distressed. That's what the profession is about. She turns the lights on. Now, what do you get from all of this? You get a sense of what the people who are holding this system together are driven by, and what's at the heart of the nursing and midwifery professions. I'm not talking just the Florence Nightingale scenario, though I will come back to that. She was a remarkable young woman as well. I'm talking about what could be. That's what I'm talking about. I'm talking about if there was an engagement of trust and you had people like that, they have shown us what's possible. And they have shown the government, if it were able to understand and to listen, how we could reimagine, in difficult circumstances, what the health service is about and what it can deliver through yourselves. Very briefly, I just want to say that there are good things happening, and you know them, good things that are being led by, for example, clinical nurse specialists. The cancer program is one. Nursing in the community, particularly with the projected, which is now shelved, scheme for diabetes nurses. There's lots of good things happening. Lots of good things happening, and I wouldn't want to say otherwise. But my point is, so much more could be happening. I think, was there an award to one of the students yesterday from St. Vincent's? Oh, have I blown it? No, yeah. Okay, well, that's, you see, God forbid, I thought it was last night. I thought it was last night. But,
You're supposed to speak off the mic before you ask a question like that.
okay. Okay. Well, there is an important point there. You know, to feel valued, to be recognized by your peers, that doesn't cost anything. And that's where you have a trust-based relationship in the hospital. So the director of nursing, I mean, funnily enough, that's something that Mary would share very much with Sister Kinsella, who would often say, look, right, it's great when I know how little I know, because I can reach out to people then who do know. And it's great to see, whatever level you're working at, people reaching out and wanting their colleagues, particularly young nurses, to come through and understand what a contribution they can make. A ceremony like that tonight, great leaders in the profession are born out of those kind of moments and that kind of recognition. There are others. For example, you've only got to look at the indicators to see how stressed our society is, particularly with long-term and youth unemployment. But that stress is not restricted to the people with whom you engage in delivering care. It impacts on you as well. It impacts on you as well. And there's an awful lot that can be done to help your colleagues in that kind of situation, covering from them, time off, all kinds of stuff. But you know, it doesn't come under the rubric of contractualism. But that's what you do anyway. And they are some of the good things. It's really about being valued. I'd also mention maybe the Galway Clinic. Is it a coincidence that Jimmy Sheehan started the Galway Clinic with Morrison Edigan? They started it because they wanted to do what they do best, help people. Jimmy Sheehan's the Galway Clinic is a very remarkable place. It didn't have to be there, and it is there not because of the state, not because of the state, but because of the passion and commitment of Jimmy Sheehan and his wife Rosemary. They put it there, and it combines a business model with a care model that is awesome, and you can feel it when you go in. Now, I'm sure you could say the same thing about your own institutions, but the really good institutions, what do you get? You get the vocational element there. You go through the Galway Clinic and they're focused on you as a patient at every level, whether you're the consultant or the person who looks after keeping the place clean. The focus is on you. It's a participative culture that is very values-based, but brings out the scope for excellence in delivering healthcare. I tell you, Jimmy Sheehan told me he was never once asked for his views on national policy. That's what goes down. Let me try and bring this together. The nature of nursing and midwifery as professions, and even more so as callings, it needs to be set in context because, I mean, I know what you might be thinking. You might be thinking, well, you know, talking about the nursing as a vocational and calling, you also have to put bread on the table. You also have to look at the emigration of our best and our brightest nurses and the cost of that to the country. You also have to figure that if you're driven by a vocational dimension, that it may give comfort to those who are coming from a different place. It might be seen as acquiescing in policies that are wrong and that are flawed. And I'm very conscious of that. I know where you're coming from in this. And you know what? I simply have no answer to it. Because the practicalities are that your vocation can be exploited. That you do your best, and that's an awful lot, and it's never enough. So in looking at the dichotomy between the vocational and the contractual, I'm aware that there is a space there, and that space is the space that you live out your lives in. And as I said, I have no answer as to how you can square that circle. I know that you can't ignore either of them. Um, it would be impertinent of me to suggest how you strike that balance, which arises from the reality that those who enforce the contractual perspective, as I said, do so on the premise that you'll respond from a vocational dimension. You see, if the mandarins were to meet the professions in the middle ground of the common good, it would more than justify that kind of effort. There was a celebrated article on leadership in the Harvard Business Review, and it said, what is leadership? I asked my students that quite a few times, and they give long definitions, but the product of a 5-year study in Harvard was, what is leadership? Leadership is humility with fierce resolve. Humility with fierce resolve. And in the leaders that I talked about there, whether it's Mary Aikenhead, or whether it's Mary Owens, or whether it's Jimmy Sheehan, you see that characteristic in all of them. Humility with fierce resolve. If the state showed a little humility in saying, we screwed up, maybe we didn't get the balance right, maybe for once we would engage with our own people, to serve our own people, and ask the troika to wait in the waiting room. Maybe then we could actually get things done. So the final message of these few remarks was suggested to me by one of your own, who is I have three girls. One, the oldest one, older one, she's in her late 20s now. She works in a high dependency unit. And I sent her a text the other morning before she went on duty at an ungodly time, and I said, what on earth am I going to say to the delegates? What on earth am I going to say? And she sent me back a text saying, leave them with a message of hope, appreciation, and admiration. And in the annoying way of daughters, she was absolutely right. Her graduation was in St. Michael's, and I've been to many graduations and I've presided over a few, but it was by far the most impressive. And Nicky German was there, and Mary was there, and which good leaders always are. And Bishop Ray Field was there at the graduation. He did the ceremony of the blessing of the hands. And that was just, it was really what it's all about. Here's what he said. I congratulate the various members of staff and all who have helped you to this day. I praise them and their work for the standards that they uphold. They teach and uphold values which are essential in today's society, and they ensure that the deep respect in which the nursing profession is held is maintained and enhanced. In an atmosphere of clinical excellence and ongoing professionalism, they put the nursing care of the sick at the center of everything, and with it, they focus on the essential human dignity of each single person and on the sacredness of life itself. Into your hands now is entrusted all that they have lived and believed in and handed on to you so diligently. Our hope is that you will continue to live these values, valuing the essential human dignity of every single individual entrusted to your care, and that you will extend that love and kindness and compassion, which is the hallmark of a truly great nurse, to each and every one of your patients. I don't want to be glib by saying, I really would like to send that to politicians and say, think and reflect on it. Thank you very much.